All right, so hopefully everybody can see the slides okay. What we're going to be starting with today, or what we're going to continue with today, is in the second chapter of First Thessalonians. It's the first part of it, verses 1 through 12. And the title that was given to this lesson is Helping the Baby Grow Up. And the baby, of course, is the church. So remember last week, we talked about this last week, but I brought it back this week just to keep everything in front of people. So Paul was on his second missionary journey, okay, and he had been in Asia over here in Troas, and he got this vision of a man from Macedonia calling him to come to Macedonia, which is this peninsula, the Greek peninsula over here. Okay, so he sailed across to Philippi and got himself in trouble in Philippi, was imprisoned. The earthquake came, broke him loose. Eventually he left Philippi and he went on to Thessalonica. And Thessalonica is number 3 on the map right here. Okay, and there he was there for about only 3 weeks, very short period of time. But he got some of the Jewish community and some of the Greek community to convert to Christianity. Okay, and then he was driven away. So he went a short distance to Berea, which is number 4 on the map. I'm trying to put my cursor there. It's a little hard. There he got a better reception, but the people that were mad at him in Thessalonica came over to Berea and drove him away from there. He left, but Silas and Timothy stayed behind. This is all described in the book of Acts. You can read it in the book of Acts. So from Berea, Paul went on to Athens, and we're familiar, of course, with Athens. It's the big city in Greece here, number 5 on the map. And that's where he gave his famous sermon on Mars Hill and stayed for a little while there. But eventually he left Athens and went to Corinth, which is number 6 on the map right here. And there he stayed for a couple of years. So his trip to Macedonia took him to several stops on his way to Corinth. He stayed in Corinth for a couple of years. And while he was in Corinth, he kept getting messages from the people in Thessalonica where he had established the church. And he responded to those messages and the feedback he was getting by writing 2 letters, which are now recorded by us as First and Second Thessalonians. So we're studying First Thessalonians right now. And this is Paul writing to the church in Thessalonica while he's in Corinth. So he was carrying out this ministry, particularly in Thessalonica, in the face of severe criticism and even physical threats to his life, which is why he left. We'll discuss some of those criticisms today that he was subjected to. And what's important, though, is not what the critics said, but how he responded to those criticisms, and we'll discuss that too. I bring this up a lot in this class. A lot of times, a useful thing that I really learned from Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, where he brought up this person named Viktor Frankl. You guys have heard me talk about this before. Does anybody remember who Viktor Frankl was and why I like to talk about him?
Pastor in Germany.
He was a German Jew, actually, who was imprisoned by the Nazis, and he survived the Holocaust, and he was a psychiatrist, I think, or a psychologist, and he wrote after the Holocaust. And one of the key things that Frankl published was basically the notion that you can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to the things that happen to you. And that knowledge of the fact that he could control his response in the face of horrible things happening to him is what helped him get through the period of time he was in the concentration camp. And that's what Stephen Covey picked up in his book, that we can't control the world around us, but we can control how we respond to it. And Covey talks about circles of concern and circles of influence. So our circle of concern, we were just having a prayer. And among the things that's in our circle of concern are the wildfires in California, the war in Ukraine, the fighting that's going on in the Middle East are all in our circle of concern. But really, those are not in our circle of influence right now. There's not much that we can do about any one of those three things. There are some other concerns that we have that are in our circle of influence, like the ministry of Supplee Church. We can have influence on that. We can do things about that. But what Covey brought out was that as you involve yourself in stuff, as you take on responsibilities, as you broaden your horizons, your circle of influence expands. And you can begin to have more and more influence about the things that happen around you. So
farther and farther out.
yeah. So Frankel's message was you can't control those things that are all in your circle of concern. But you can control how you respond to the ones that are in your circle of influence. And by doing that, you can expand that circle of influence, become a more influential person, and have more of an impact in your life. And in our case, of course, we're looking to have that impact for to glorify God would be the way I'd put it. Quoting Matthew 5:16, let your light so shine before men that they will glorify God. They will see your good works and glorify the Father in heaven, I think is the way it's put. All right. So now we're looking at Paul. We're going to be looking today at Paul, and we're going to be looking at how Paul responded to the criticisms he was facing. So, and what we'll see as we look into this deeper is that, first of all, he responded to that with faithfulness to God, trust in God. Secondly, he responded to the criticisms with a caring concern for the people around him. And we're going to see in this section some excellent guidelines for Christian ministry based on those responses that Paul had to the criticisms he faced. So now we're going to read the passage. And I'm going to need somebody to volunteer to read it. It's going to be a couple pages on the screen. So who wants to volunteer? Roger's going to volunteer.
You know, brothers, that our visit to you was not a failure. We had previously suffered and been insulted in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in spite of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as men approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please man, but God, who tests our hearts. You know, we have never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up for greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from men, not from you or anyone else. As apostles of Christ, we could have been a burden to you, but we were gentle among you, like a mother caring for her little children. We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us. Surely you remember, brothers, that our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order to be I'm trying to read it, to be a burden to anyone while we preach the gospel of God to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you, who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, overcoming, comforting, and urging you to the lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory.
Okay, so thank you, Roger.
Sure.
So that was today's passage. Nobody likes to be criticized. We always bristle when we're criticized, even if the criticism is real. I can tell you back when I was working as an engineer, we would undergo these project reviews once in a while. And there was a gentleman up in management of the company that would chair the project reviews. He and his team would come down and we'd give presentations. And things have changed a bit in the workplace over the years since this was happening, but people used to be kind of brutal to one another. And this gentleman had a reputation for being particularly ruthless in his willingness to criticize your work.
Personally,
Well,
or on the basis of the work product?
the work product or the progress you were making or, that sort of thing. He was, he had a reputation and everybody knew it and everybody hated it. They knew he was coming and we were going to have to undergo this review and we knew it was going to be painful.
And he wasn't bashful about calling a spade a spade.
Maybe not, but anyway, everyone knew this was coming. Okay, but the problem was that I always knew what was wrong. I always knew what our problems were. I could see the train coming. We're struggling in this area. We need to do more of this or that. Okay, we knew that already. And then this guy would come in and jam it down our throats, and it really wasn't helpful because we already knew, where the area was that was difficult.
And that's where you should have opened your presentation.
Yeah, we did. And then, it got, if you told him what was wrong, he didn't say, "Oh, I see, what's wrong." He would just jump on it. And, it was really tough. He had a reputation throughout the company. I used to say, I'd like to be that guy when I grow up. I thought it was a wonderful job, come in and see what's wrong, yell at everybody for it and then leave. So
Negativity, though, it was a lot of negativity.
it was unpleasant. No one liked it, and I don't think it was particularly beneficial to anybody either. But anyway, that's what happened, and I still remember how that felt, when we were undergoing those criticisms, even though we knew that the criticism was valid. So no one likes to be criticized. You don't like to be criticized, period. It's never fun. So what do we do if someone is saying false things about us? Do we take Jesus' advice and turn the other cheek, or do we defend ourselves?
Depends who it is, to me. If it's just somebody who's always spreading rumors at work or whatever, then who cares?
Sometimes you disregard it.
Yeah, sometimes it depends the source, I think.
Sometimes you have to defend yourself
Yeah.
because it might mean your job if you don't.
So is everyone sort of saying it depends?
Well,
You gotta eat.
you look at political campaigns. If you look at political campaigns, there are plenty of lies and plenty of calling out of the lies.
But we're supposed to be better than that. We're supposed to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, the right reaction depends on the circumstances. I think that was kind of the consensus I heard in here. So Paul was being unjustly criticized by his enemies in this case. And in this case, he chose to defend himself. Some people, and I don't know what your reaction was when you were reading that passage, and I have to admit that sometimes I'm in this category of accusing Paul of being a little bit arrogant, tooting his own horn, because the things he says in passages like this about, he's sort of telling them how much he's done and how great he is, and that grates on me a little bit when I read that kind of thing. But in this case, he's doing it to defend himself against these unjust criticisms that he was hearing. So let's first look at the various criticisms that we can infer. Really, we have to make inferences from this passage because he's responding to something that we don't have the criticisms in front of him. We only really see his response. So apparently they're accusing him of being a criminal.
A convicted felon.
Yep. He'd been imprisoned in Philippi. Some may have said that he was a criminal on the run from justice, and they would reason that nobody should listen to somebody like that. So that was one of the criticisms. Another criticism of him was that he was deluded. They said he was in error. There's a thin line between genius and insanity. Festus, remember when Paul was, maybe you don't remember, but, as Paul was being arrested prior to his fourth journey, he was passed from tribunal to tribunal, and one of them was Festus, and Festus thought he was crazy when he came before Festus. Festus's reaction was, this man's out of his mind. Jesus' family thought he was crazy. Here's this passage. I'll just read it to you. It's from Mark chapter 3, verses 20 to 21. And it says, then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he's out of his mind. Jesus' family didn't understand his ministry either. Christian standards are so different from the world's standards that we can appear to be a little bit crazy. Can any of you think of examples of that?
Well, I was asked one time if the Bible was just a bunch of stories instead of, being true. But people, if they're not brought up that way, well, I shouldn't say that because there's plenty of people in older age that convert. But I don't know why I believe so hard. I mean, I know we had it in our family that, Jesus is the Son of God. And a lot of people would make comments on Blessed Mother, how she really got pregnant, and so many things that it's hard to defend when you feel it in your heart, but you don't, from what you were taught. But how do you defend something like that? When people say, Mary, they would say obscene things about Mary, Especially the Muslims with Mary. They don't believe that at all.
So I don't think I'm really asking about theological stuff. I'm asking about behaviors.
Yeah, the concept of turning the other cheek instead of, retribution.
Or group think. I mean, a group will have a certain way that they think, and when you're contrary to that, you're aberrant some way.
Mm-hmm. So in what ways are in what ways, and I think Roger hit on a good one. The idea of turning the other cheek is not normal. Okay, someone might think you were crazy if you did that.
Yeah, why would you not fight back?
Oh, but you do that a lot when people, that don't believe in what you believe and you're still friends with them. I mean,
I'm not talking about beliefs here, though. I'm talking about just general behavior. Do we behave differently?
even in your general behavior, your beliefs of doing something that's different, and like skydiving or something like that, and you think that's dangerous, but you're still friends with that person.
Why would you give up your Sunday mornings to go to church when you could be out playing golf?
Right.
Yeah.
Can people tell that we're different? Or is our behavior different enough so that people notice it?
Not always.
I think I've been accused of being self-righteous more than being crazy. People will say, oh, you think you're better than me because you don't, because you go to church on Sunday, or you think you're better than me because you help this poor person. You know what I mean? I think I've been seen in that light more than that I'm deluded or crazy, just that
But not proselytizing, just what your behavior is.
Yeah, not talking about it, just, yeah.
So people would say you're going down to help out at the whosoever mission means that you're self-righteous.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, you're a goody goody. You're trying
Yeah.
to trying
Why
to
do you
look.
drive
You're
that
trying to look
Germantown
good for other
to
people.
tutor these guys who are never gonna make anything of themselves anyway, these repeat criminals. You drive all the way to Germantown to spend an hour with them, you're crazy. Who do you think you are? What difference are you gonna make? That kind of a thing.
Say, didn't you tutor down there for a while?
Yeah.
So,
My friend was,
and people criticized you for doing that?
yeah.
It's hard to
Yeah.
believe.
Oh yeah, I was called a holy roller.
And what did you do with that criticism? Did you fight back against it or just accept it?
Your opinion. That's your opinion.
Nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's a really good example of what we're talking about here.
Did people criticize anyone for helping out for room at the inn?
I haven't heard that.
No.
There might be, I mean, I haven't heard it, but you could sort of understand that there might be people that say you're nuts to go
Right.
do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Faye, did you happen to invite any of your critics to come and help?
No. I didn't want to be in the car with them an hour.
Good reason.
No, I'm just kidding.
That's turning the other cheek.
Yeah, really.
Okay, so the second thing is or maybe this is the third one, they accused him of having impure motives. Christians spoke of the love feast and the kiss of peace, and the evil minds could read things into that weren't there. Really, the idea of communion in the early church was kind of frightening to
They
people.
thought it
Yeah,
was
it's like cannibalism.
Yeah. They accused him of trying to trick others. And this is one, well, go back, trying to trick others. Why are you doing this? You're trying to fool me into doing something? What's your motive for trying? That's all part of the impure motives thing too. And they accused him of seeking to please men, not God. He preached the freedom of grace versus the slavery of legalism, and some think that that they're not religious if they're not unhappy. So avoid the slavery of legalism. They also accused him of preaching for his own personal financial gain. You can't quite get that, but the Greek word that's used for flattery, if you remember, it mentioned that he doesn't use flattery, but that Greek word really describes flattery motivated by gain, sort of kissing up to somebody to try to get something from them. Okay.
But the word is specific for you getting something back.
Yes. So there were people like that, still are. There are plenty of people like that are, who are trying, who are preaching for the sake of financial gain. The Didache. This is a little bit of a digression. Pastor Na just walked in just as I put this on the screen.
Yeah, he can probably read that.
That's all I'm doing. That almost made it into the New Testament.
Did it?
That and the Shepherd of Hermas, yeah, it was very close. In fact, a lot of the stuff in there you'll find in the Gospels.
The Didache is also known as the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations. And it's a brief, anonymous early Christian treatise dated by modern scholars to the 1st century, which would make it among the very oldest things we've got. It could be considered the first book of order. It talks about Christian ethics. It talks about rituals such as baptism and the Eucharist. And it talks about church organization.
So why didn't it make
Yeah,
it
how come
into
it
the
didn't make it?
Testament?
Oh, I should have said not Gospels, but the New Testament. Why? In 2 minutes, it didn't pass all the criteria. So no matter how old or good the document and how passionately some churches argued for it, if it had not sustained enough faith communities persecution and have been attested in a practical way as having helped people with the faith through time, then no matter how passionately one side of the church might have wanted it, it couldn't check all the boxes. It has to be from the apostolic. So that one was very, very close, like Shepherd of Hermas, very, very close. But it goes both ways. Revelation was this close to not making it, and it was also this close to not making. So it depends on who the bishops are who are voting in the church councils when the canon was formed. And just to let you know, there were different canons. So in some canons, this did exist as a part of the New Testament, but not in enough canons, and not enough bishops and jurisdictions recognize it, either not knowing it or not recognizing it as authoritative for their faith in life. So that's a summary of, in the end, a council has to approve it.
And you've mentioned this before, the persecution, something that's a help to the people that were
one of the
persecuted.
criteria.
Then that is one of the main criteria for entrance.
Right, so there's some practical ways in which the bishops have to argue for it. There are, of course, theological reasons for arguing for it. Some of the Gnostic texts, probably later than earlier, but because some of what they taught in those texts were not acceptable, you might know the name Irenaeus or Tertullian. They were the most vocal, and they wrote tons against the Gnostic teachings, and so Gnostic texts did not make it into the canon. Some people think they should have, especially the book called Gospel of Thomas. It's just a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus. And some scholars used to think, not anymore, I think it has shifted. They used to think that there was the earliest work, and it predated anything in the New Testament, and that it was truer to Jesus' teachings than the Gospels were. The Gospels fix things. It turns out actually that probably was inaccurate. But anyway, that's a nutshell version of.
None of which is why I have this in this presentation. Okay, what I just wanted to let you know what the Didache is, so that when I quote from it, you'll see what the basis of that is. It says, "Let every apostle that cometh unto you be received as the Lord, and he shall stay one day, and if need be, the next also. But if he stay 3 days, he's a false prophet."
Huh.
So there's this idea of false prophets, that are, and that's, part of what Paul is getting at here.
Is the implication you're trying too hard or something like that?
No, you're milking the congregation for your support.
Oh, I see.
Okay, and Paul made Paul,
Like that Greek word of gain.
Yes. How did Paul feed himself? Does anyone know?
It's a tent maker.
Right. He was a tent maker. He makes a point of that, that he didn't depend on he wasn't one of these itinerant preachers that was coming around staying with people, getting people to feed him, getting people to take care of him, and then he'd move on to somewhere else. Paul would support himself through his own, he had his own craft, and he had earned his own livelihood through tent making. So I thought this was a cute quote, though. And does it ring?
It's like Ben Franklin's comment about house guests.
Yeah,
3 days, yes.
yeah, it might have inspired that. Okay, Ben Franklin said, guests like fish begin to smell after 3 days.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm going the wrong way. That's what's wrong. Even the early church knew the perennial problem of those who traded on charity. Have any of you run into that? Have any of you ever
We're into,
been victimized by someone that took advantage of your good nature?
oh, sure.
I had a number of experiences like that in my youth, where people would show up at the church and we would try to do all sorts of things to help them out, and they just exploited it. In fact, not only in my youth, it happened here not that long ago. And it can put you off. It can, it can make you throw in the towel. It can discourage you from wanting to help people.
It is discouraging.
Right,
Or you can think of it as planting seeds,
right.
Yeah,
You have to look past that.
Yeah.
But there definitely are people who will come to the church and look for help, and come to the deacons or somebody, and it turns out that it's not a legitimate, it's just, what's the right word? They're grifters. They also accused him of seeking personal prestige. Some preachers seek to display themselves and not the message. They accused him of being something of a dictator. But his gentleness was that of a wise father, and his was the love which knew how to be firm. He knew that people needed discipline. So sometimes he, would correct them. So Paul's response, and this is according to the Worsby commentary that I used for this. His response was faithful. We talked about his response being faithful and demonstrating concern for others. It was faithful in the manner in which he did it, in the message that he provided, in the motive that he had, in the method of his ministry. I'm going to talk about every one of these points. He demonstrated caring concern for the believers in his work, in his walk, and his words. And you can tell this comes from Worsby. How can you tell? I wonder if any of you have been in these classes long enough.
Alliteration.
Alliteration.
Yep, he loves alliteration. So we'll dig into those a little bit deeper. He'd been faithful in the manner of his ministry, and this is where we can look at the verses again. He said he had a holy boldness that was born of dedication to God. Paul and Silas had been beaten at Philippi, yet they came to Thessalonica. They weren't dissuaded by that. They were bold and faithful. In the message, he assured them that his message was true. 6 times in this letter, he mentions the gospel. The message of Christ's death and resurrection is the only true gospel, and Paul made sure to bring that out. He was faithful in the motive of his ministry. His motives were pure. It's possible to preach the right message with the wrong motives. Paul didn't use the gospel as a cloak to cover covetousness, and he was sensitive about money matters. He was faithful in the method of his ministry. He was calling people to Christ. He didn't use guile or trickery. And he says in verse 3, he says, "For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you." He's just trying to get the gospel message out there. Here's another quote from Paul from his letter to the Philippians. Would anyone like to read this one?
It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice.
So that's an interesting commentary on this, right? Does
The
the
message is more important than the medium.
right?
This could be problematic for many Christians.
Mm.
People don't like what he wrote there. In fact, the churches now, has ever divided along that line. Well, they might be preaching X, Y, Z, but we don't like what they're preaching and how, or who is preaching and so forth. So, but Paul seemed to be open to anybody.
I think we're all a little bit guilty of that, because we all have our own theological viewpoint, our own set of Christian priorities. And it's pretty easy to criticize someone else, but
Can I do a little confession? It's been decades, and I still stand this way, although more graciously, I hope. I remember televangelists on TV, and some of them I wish they weren't preaching the gospel.
No, it
That's
made
too
a
much
bad
confession.
reputation for everyone else. Exactly.
But I remember when I came across this, I said, well, geez, what did Paul know in his heart for peace that I need to learn? And it's a tough one, because I wish some people were not. And sometimes they have tens of thousands of people in their congregation or audience.
Well,
Well,
the problem is, the bakers and Jim and Tammy Faye and whatever. The problem is that, yeah, part of their message is what they say, and they may be saying the right words, but another part of their message is how they live.
I guess that's how I usually. But then again, as Jay said, we are all a little bit.
Yeah, none of this is perfect. Yeah.
And there's certainly Christians who wish I weren't teaching or preaching. I'm certainly open to that.
well, right. I mean, there are plenty of some of the people that we would complain about think that Presbyterians can't possibly be Christian.
Right.
So
We're doing okay then.
And God can use anybody's words to do anything he chooses.
Even Presbyterian.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in a sense, he's chosen to use even those who make us uncomfortable.
Sure.
mhm. Of course, I think you could say Satan, you can use anybody's words too. So it's, yeah, I think we need to be discerning, but the gospel's the gospel, and if it gets preached, that's a good thing. So,
Yeah.
and I guess I guess maybe what we're forgetting in the conversation is the work of the Holy Spirit. Because it's not really up to us to bring people to Christ. It's the Spirit's job. Our job is to expose them and let the Spirit do its work. And, so if one of these televangelists happens to expose somebody to the word and the Holy Spirit takes root, wonderful. Why would we complain about that? And if some Presbyterian preacher does it, why would we complain about that either? So which is it? Does the end justify the means?
Oh,
Paul sought to please God, not people. He said that right in this passage. He said he was not out for personal gain. And he said he didn't flatter people in order to gain wealth, prestige, or acceptance. So, how did Paul respond to the criticism? This is, we need to start taking this stuff to heart for ourselves. Who are we out to please? Are we out to please God, or are we out to please people? If we want to emulate Paul, we should be trying to please God. Are we out for personal gain? I can say with great confidence that I'm not out for personal gain in anything I do for the church or for the scout troop.
You know you love your salary from teaching this class.
Yeah. Yeah. Nancy did offer to double it.
Yeah, she did.
May I ask for context that just this right here that you've highlighted, bolded, which I appreciate. This is the countercultural thing that Paul knows in the Greco-Roman world in which he lives. That's precisely what in rhetoric and in politics you're groomed to and learn the techniques to do well, especially in what's called sophism or sophistry or rhetoric. And in fact, if you want to be a good politician, you must know the art of doing all of these things.
Right.
Machiavelli would agree too, but so would any manual of good public leadership. To make deals and get things done. In fact, senators and representatives know this as well. Whether to get elected or to get past some bills or
they wouldn't be senators or representatives.
I suppose.
That's how they got there.
But it is countercultural still today. But in the Roman Empire, these are just known ways in which any respectful, accomplished person in civil life or imperial life would be groomed, and art and science of pleasing people and gaining personal prestige and honor, and learning how to not so much flatter, we think of that as negative, but to build others up so that I could get what I need or want.
Persuade, would that be a
Right,
word?
persuasion, that's what's the whole thing in rhetoric, right?
Yeah, I think you weren't in here when we talked about the Greek word that appears in this particular passage for the word flattery.
Yes, yes.
And it did sound like it's more like kissing up to people.
More like a con.
Right, there's a negative, certainly. Yeah, he does not approve of these ways of, obviously.
And in our times, we have Dale Carnegie. How to win friends and influence people.
There you go. Yeah.
Paul cared for the believers. He compares his gentle approach to that of a mother caring for her own children. And he spoke with authority, but always used that authority in love. So he loved the new Christians and willingly shared the gospel with them. He'd been lovingly concerned. That's the next thing he talks about. And his work shows that concern. We talked about this already, but he made tents, paid his own way, and he uses the word toil and hardship. It wasn't easy to make tents and minister at once, but that distinguished him from the greedy false prophets who might have been out at it for personal gain. His walk showed his concern. His life was holy and pious. His life was also righteous. He did his duty toward the believers, and his life was also pretty blameless.
Unless you were one of his critics, in which case you had plenty of blame for him.
Well, they were, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I don't think those criticisms were valid though. So they could say things about him, but they might not have been true. His words showed his concern. He treated he treated the people like they were his own children. He encouraged them personally. He also confronted them when necessary, and he urged them on. Paul's aim was that his children might live lives worthy of God. So here's what we can derive. We're getting close to done. Maybe a little early today, which is a good thing, I guess. This probably is hard to read from where you're sitting. So I'll just go over it with you, but you could pull out the Bibles that we distributed and turn to First Thessalonians Chapter 2, and you can see this stuff in there. Okay. It gives, the commentator said, this was probably the Life Application Bible commentary. It says, First Thessalonians 2 gives a rich description of how a true Christian minister, a missionary, a pastor, or a teacher should look. Too often the bad examples are paraded in the media, while the many solid, spirit-filled servants of God get little notice. Believers need to be able to distinguish godly ministers from frauds, and Paul gave a number of ways to tell which is which. So, in verse 2, a godly minister is bold enough to share the gospel in the face of opposition. That's one mark. Verse 3, a godly minister speaks the truth. Also in verse 3, a godly minister has pure motives. In verse 4, a godly minister seeks to please God, not people. In verse 5, a godly minister does not use flattery as a tool and is not greedy. In verse 6, a godly minister does not seek people's praise. In verse 7, a godly minister is gentle, like a mother caring for their children. In verse 8, a godly minister loves the believers and willingly shares his life in the gospel with them. In verse 9, a godly minister works hard so as not to be a burden to anyone while preaching the good news. In verse 10, a godly minister is righteous, pure, honest, and faultless toward the believers. In verse 11, a godly minister treats the believers as a good father would treat his own children. And in verse 12, a godly minister pleads, encourages, and urges believers to live in a way that God would consider worthy. That's a bunch of really good takeaways from this passage, isn't it?
A lot of points.
A lot of points. And it talks about a godly minister, but I don't want us to go away thinking, okay, Jay's whole lesson was geared at Pastor Na over there.
Well, it should be. All pastors are.
Because we're all ministers, aren't we?
Right.
You know, so this applies to every single one of us. Okay, if we're going to allow the Holy Spirit to work through us, we should try to pick up on all 12 of these points. I don't know if there's 12 there. Yeah, I think there's 12 there. You know, 12 good points of godly ministry worth thinking about. And it's amazing how you can take a short passage like this and derive so much from it. I think paper and ink were expensive back then, so they didn't waste words when they were writing stuff down. You know, so you have to unpack it. And I think that this particular commentary did a nice job of unpacking the message that's embedded in this passage. And it's stuff that we should be able to take home with us. So, you know, there it is. In his greeting that we read last week, Paul wrote, "We always thank God for all of you, mentioning you in our prayers. We continually remember before God and Father your work, produced by faith, your labor promoted by love, and your endurance inspired by hope in our Lord Jesus Christ." This is how he started the letter. He was really starting it off with words of encouragement to these people. And he talked about their work, their labor, and their endurance, and that those came out of faith, love, and hope. With Paul as their mentor, it's no wonder the church at Thessalonica prospered in spite of persecution and shared the gospel with others for miles around. And that's all stuff we should take to heart for ourselves. Faith, love, and hope. Put those into action. Look at those principles that were in the previous table. And hopefully we can expand our circle of influence, expand our ministry, and be good stewards of the gifts that God has given to us. Any last thoughts from anyone?
I think it was a jam-packed lesson today. I think it was very important. Practical.